Hello, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Growth and Development Scrutiny. Just got a bit of feedback from my right. Let's just sort that out. Are we okay now? No, still feedback.
Has someone got their loudspeaker on? Turn the volume down.
Right, okay, everybody, let's try and get a bit of a false start. So welcome everybody once again. Just to remind you that this meeting is being live streamed on YouTube, and just also to remind you that people are entitled to record or film the meeting, so probably need to mind our P's and Q's a little bit, and people are perfectly entitled to record it should they wish to do so. If I could ask you also to, which I often forget to do, is to put your phones on either silent or switch them off, one or the other. So before I actually go into the other items, I would just very much like to welcome Andrew Pegram here this afternoon. It's fantastic to see you.
Thank you.
It's great that you're looking well. So I hope your procedures are continuing and progressing well. So anyway, it's fantastic to see you here. So thank you very much indeed. So item 1, apologies for absence.
We have Councillor Cotty, and substituting is Councillor Mrs Stockwood, and we also have Councillor Howitt, and substituting should be Councillor Price, which has not arrived yet.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. Actually, like to use your microphone next time. Yeah. Well, just going to go on to say that in addition to the scrutiny group, I have also, because I thought it would be helpful and constructive, I invited, first of all, Councillor Roger Upton, who in his capacity as chairman of the planning committee, not to fire any specific questions at him, but I thought that maybe he might be able to make some contributions. I also invited the cabinet member responsible for planning, Councillor Edevine, but he's still on another tour meeting, so I don't think he's going to be able to join us. And I also invited Councillor Combalak to join us as well, because it was Councillor Combalak who instigated the original matrix for this scrutiny item. So I just thought it would be better to, and helpful, to be able to maybe contribute to a more constructive discussion, because I'm quite sure everybody agrees that probably planning is the highest profile or highest public profile, but along with maybe collecting the bins perhaps, but let's say planning applications are one of the highest profile functions that this council performs, so I'm sure that it is of interest to an enormous amount of people. Right, so item 2, are there any declarations of interest, please? Take silence as no. Item 3, the minutes of the meeting that we held on the 26th of January. Can I sign those as a true and correct record?
Yes.
All in favour? Anybody against? Nope. So we move on to the substantive, the main item of our discussions, which are planning communications. Very important, as I indicated earlier, that we are able to communicate in all matters that relate to planning. And we have recommendations there. We may well want to add to those recommendations. I think I'm going to invite Mr. Ashcroft to present the reports, or sorry, Mr. Pegram, I do apologise. That's my first mistake of the afternoon. I'll invite Mr. Pegram to present the report. I thought maybe just as members can assemble their questions in their minds, whilst I wouldn't normally want to do this, I think the best way of dealing with this report once it's been presented is perhaps to go through page by page or paragraph by paragraph. Otherwise, I can see we're going to be jumping backwards and forwards, turning pages forever and a day. So I think that just might be a bit more of an efficient way of proposing it. I don't know, Councillor Comblack, is there anything you want to say at this stage at all in the matrix? If not, then I'll move on to. So, Mr. Pegram, would you like to present the report, please?
Thank you very much, Chairman. The paper is aptly named Planning Communications, and obviously that encompasses a wide range of issues. There's not only our communications with the likes of yourselves and the parish councils, but the report also deals with things like consultations on planning applications and how we conduct that at Rushcliffe. So if I can have the next slide, please. Sorry, don't I? So the presentation is structured pretty much in line with the report you have before you. The first slide really just highlights some of the key issues that we'll go through in this presentation and that are discussed in the paper. So we will look at the service standards which have recently been refined, look at planning communications generally and how we communicate with people, and some of the improvements that we've actually already delivered, partly as a result of this process, the scrutiny process in preparing for the meeting. Interpretation of planning policy, it's not really witchcraft or rocket science. It is set out black and white, but obviously for the layperson can sometimes cause a little bit of confusion or concern about how we actually apply the policies that we use when we do planning applications. We will look at the consultation process and how we do it at Rushcliffe. That differs somewhat from some other councils, and I'll highlight that as we go through. Some of the procedures for the determination of planning applications. And one issue that was raised on Councillor Cumblack's matrix, which I won't go into great detail because it is the subject of a separate scrutiny item, is that of conservation areas. So as I say, I'm not intending to deal with that in any detail this afternoon, other than perhaps to answer any questions. So first slide then, the service standards. These are now displayed on the website. They were refined in my absence by Mr. Ashcroft as part of looking at improvements in the service, largely brought in or refined in response to the very heavy workload that we had or currently have in terms of number of applications. So if I reflect back to around about August, September last year when I was running performance stats, we were up 40% on the previous year. Some might say pandemic year, applications would have been down, and in fact that previous year they were 16% up on the previous year to that. So there has been a steady increase in application. Well, I say steady, quite a significant increase in applications last year. So the overarching objective of the service standards is to ensure greater transparency in the process, perhaps dispel some of the myths, ensure that applications are progressed in an efficient way, ensuring that where possible, applications can be dealt with within the timescales expected by government. That's not always possible, and it's sometimes as a result of us offering a better service to applicants and objectors potentially in negotiating on schemes to deliver a better scheme. And in those circumstances, we can agree an extension of time. But the aim would be to try and deal with most applications or the majority of applications within those timescales. And improve communications with applicants and agents and yourselves as elected councillors. Should probably have included on there as well parish councils, because I know clearly parish councils are very much involved in the process and very interested in what we do. So next slide, please. So in terms of notification of decisions, this is where I can highlight some changes that we have made as a result of this process. Long established standards or procedures, we will notify ward councillors, town and parish councils and parish meetings of the decisions on planning applications and where applications have been withdrawn. So that's a standard one that's been going for a long time. Also, we give notification of any appeals that are submitted. And again, this is where we have made a bit of a change I'll come on to in a minute, because the way that the inspectorate operate is very different to the way that we operate. If someone wants to know the decision on a planning appeal, you have to tell the inspectorate that you want to be notified of that decision, and then they will notify you of the decision. So some of the recent changes that we've introduced, as I say, reviewing this, partly because things change in planning quite rapidly. New applications come along, new application types. And fair to say that we've been busy, took the eye off the ball perhaps, and some of the notification procedures have been improved through this process. So again, we now will notify, we take on the responsibility, even if someone has asked PINs, we will notify ward councillors, parish and town councils, parish meetings of an appeal decision. That has been established. That's now been running for something like 4 or 5 weeks at least, I think. And the other one that we've introduced as a result of reviewing some of these processes is we will also notify ward councillors and the parish councils of enforcement notices that are served. So, and I've seen some of those going out myself. I've been copied in on some of those notifications. One area where I think was raised in the supplementary to the matrix is the question of non-material amendments. Non-material amendments are not a planning application as such. They are a request to deal with changes to an approved scheme. Under the legislation, there is no requirement to consult on an application for a non-material amendment. And again, I will come on and explain a little bit of why that is potentially. But we have now taken the decision that we will notify ward councillors, town and parish councils and parish meetings of a decision when we make agree or not agree a non-material amendment. And again, that is now enshrined in our processes. Next slide, please. So enforcement, again, is another issue. We've now got the policy that went through quite recently, and clearly very this is one area of planning that everyone watches very carefully, public, councillors, everyone. So I think it's important, though, to acknowledge that in terms of enforcement action is discretionary. We don't have to take action just because someone's breached planning. I think it would be a poor move for any council to turn around and say, we're not going to investigate breaches of planning. We have what we consider to be adequate resources to resource our enforcement team, and we do take it very seriously, and we will go out, investigate every complaint that we receive, and obviously follow that through with investigations. Having said that, in a large number of the investigations we conduct, we find that there's no breach. So I think the last time I ran figures, it was something in the region of 45–50% of the complaints that we receive on enforcement are not a breach. It could be that it's not development. It could be that it's what you will know as permitted development, i.e. it's planning permission that's granted by one of the development orders. So we get out on site and find that there's no action needed, and we will close that case down. The other aspect is we may consider that it's not expedient to take action. For instance, it might be that if someone submitted a planning application, and we will try and pursue people to submit a planning application to regularise the situation, but if they don't submit a planning application, if it's one that might be approved, then we may decide that it's not expedient to take action, and we'll close that case down. In that instance, I would say it's the property owner that's taking the risk, because when they come to sell their property, a solicitor is going to say, have you got planning permission for this extension or whatever? And they will turn around then and say no, and it may cause a delay in the sale of their property. When a breach is found, we then have to we may have to do some necessary monitoring and collect evidence, and that can sometimes take time. And I think that's one of the frustrations with members of the public. They lodge a complaint, and it perhaps, to use the phrase, disappears into a black hole, and they wonder what's going on. One case that I can think of where it went on and on and on was we had a complaint about a property that was using their property for car sales. and people were sending us evidence from whatever car site it was on the website, and we had to monitor that to see what the level of usage was. The other aspect, when I say level of usage, is we need to identify, has there been a material change of use? So it might be at a level where, again, planning permission isn't required because it's not a material change of use. But again, we have tried to improve that process in making sure that people are kept, where we can tell them, kept abreast of the investigations. It may be in some circumstances that we can't share some information because it might prejudice our investigation and any action that we might take. And on the last bullet point, perhaps an important one, is formal action should only be taken as a last resort. There is recently published a league table of authorities and those that have served the most enforcement notices. I think I take the view that if we have to serve an enforcement notice, we may have failed in resolving that breach through negotiation. So to me, a successful outcome is where we've negotiated the situation, removed the breach, and it's been dealt with, and we don't have to serve an enforcement notice. If we get into the service of enforcement notices, you've then got the issue of potential appeals or court action and so on. So again, if we can deal with it through negotiation, we will. And the point at the bottom, in all scenarios, we will try and keep the person that made the complaint, whether it be a member of the public, councillor, parish council, informed of the progress of that investigation and the outcome in the case. Next slide, please. So, application of planning policy. As I say, there's no wizardry in this. Basically, I think it's fair to say that we still operate in a plan-led system. I won't read it out, you can see it on the screen, but the section 38.6 basically says the starting point for any decision is the development plan, and we must have regard to the development plan. For us, the development plan in Rushcliffe comprises local plan part 1, core strategy, Rushcliffe local plan part 2, land and planning policies, and any relevant neighbourhood plans that are adopted for the relevant areas. Where there is a need, or where there may be a difference of opinion perhaps, is in the weight that people attach to those policies and any material planning considerations. So clearly we will look at it, we will attach weight. If it comes to committee, members are quite entitled to attach different weight to those issues, whether it be policy or whether it's material planning considerations. And that's where you do sometimes get a difference of opinion in the way that people view the application of planning policy. Next slide, please. There's a lot on this slide, so I'll try and skip through it as quickly as I can. Basically, what this is saying is that the way that we consult on planning applications, first and foremost, is set out in the relevant legislation. That's the Development Management Procedure Order or the Planning Listed Buildings and Conservation Area Regulations. They set out the obligatory requirements for the publicity of any planning applications. For the vast majority of planning applications, that will involve sending letters to adjacent property owners, i.e. anyone who shares a boundary with the site, or, and I emphasise the or, display a site notice. It's not both, it's either one or the other. Sometimes we do both, and one example will be where we can't identify by address a neighbouring property, a neighbouring site. So it might be an open field, and in those circumstances, we'll put a site notice up as well as doing neighbour notification. We have to give 21 days for comment, or not less than 21 days. And also a recent change in legislation, or relatively recent change, is where there are bank holidays that fall within that 21 days, we have to add on the requisite number of days to the 21. So for instance, over Easter or in the run up to Easter, if the 21 days captured Good Friday and Bank Holiday Monday, it was 23 days. Obligatory for certain types of application is the display of a site notice or a notice in the newspaper. And typically those are major planning applications, applications accompanied by an environmental impact assessment, sites in the conservation area, listed buildings, or things like departures from the development plan. So in those instances, we will do, if it's appropriate, neighbours and site notices and notice in the press. We also undertake consultations with relevant statutory bodies. That should also say yourselves as councillors, because clearly you are consultees on a planning application. Parish and town councils are statutory consultees. Parish meetings are not. However, at Rushcliffe, this is one where I would say we perhaps do more than others. We do treat the parish meetings as exactly the same as if they're a town council or a parish meeting. In terms of yourselves, you will know that you get a targeted consultation on planning applications in your area through email, and you can link into the system and view the applications. Just to highlight some other authorities who I think don't do it as well, send a list of applications validated in that week to all their ward councillors, and it's up to the ward councillors to then look through, find their applications and comment on those applications as they see fit. That said, I don't think our councillors are disadvantaged, because you can run a weekly list. So if members are interested in things in other areas, they can run a weekly list on the planning online system and see other applications in other areas. And at Rushcliffe, as I've highlighted already, to a certain extent, we exceed the minimum requirements, and I'll come on and explain a little bit about that, where we've got two examples for you. The other aspect is to highlight perhaps is that the initial consultation will be done through looking at plans, identifying properties and sending letters to those properties. When the case officer gets out on site, you may well find that there's a house been built in a gap that wasn't on the plans, on ordnance survey plans. So therefore, we will then do another consultation with those people just to pick them up and make sure they're included. Next slide, please. So we have one example here. This is what I call a more minor example, but you can just about make out in the middle of that screen, there's a property which is hatched in purple. The application in that instance was for a side extension and a front porch extension. I'm not sure, is there a pointer on here? Right, so in that instance, the legislation would require that we notify this property here and this property here, and that is it. That's all that legislation would require. However, because in our view, the extension is clearly visible to properties on the opposite side of the road, we, in this instance, notified these three properties as well, and this property over here. The other aspect is here is if the ward boundary ran down the middle of the road, for instance, we would consult the ward councillor on this side, and we would also consult as an adjacent ward councillor the person over this side. So again, just two examples of what we do at Rushcliffe. Next slide, please. The next one is a more major development, and again an example of where we go above and beyond the legislative requirements. This is for poultry houses and associated development. You can see the application site is pretty much sat in the middle of nowhere. In that instance, the legislation would require that we did a site notice and a notice in the press, because it's a major development. The practice we adopt here is that we will notify people within 400 metres of the site. And that, in this instance, I think I worked out that some of those properties down in the right-hand corner are actually more than 400 metres away. We notified, I think, pretty much everyone in that part of Althorpe. There's also some properties at the top of the screen you can see where the blue squares are, where we notified them. This is one, again, where because the impacts of this development are likely to be wider than just the locality, we consulted Cotgrave Town Council as well on the application, as well as the parish council for the area. And I think what I'm trying to highlight here is whatever we do, whether it's to meet the legislative requirements or for our own identification purposes, it's basically what is proportionate to the impacts of the application. So clearly, I don't know if Councillor Campbell's got a question, sorry. Clearly, in this instance, we could have just put a sign notice up and said, done. This type of application, this type of application generates a lot of interest, and clearly you can see we have gone beyond what is the legislative requirement. So, did you want to? Sorry, Chairman, did you want to bring Councillor Campbell in that?
Is it specifically a clarification? Obviously, the long
Well,
debate on
yes.
one application.
You did say you consulted the adjoining parish councils,
Yep.
but not Cropple Bishop, which I'd like to know where the boundary is on that.
I would have to go away and
Yeah.
check that one, to be quite honest. So I know that I know for a fact that Cotgrave was consulted, because they rang me to say, can we have an extension on the time to submit our comments?
Well, I did ask the adjoining parish councils to be notified.
If I could take that one away for you, Councillor Campbell, and I'll come back on it.
Just in defence, actually, only because I happen to have the local knowledge as that member, Cropple Bishop did consider that application, at one of their parish council meetings. So I'm assuming, I didn't check, I was assuming that was a result of them being notified, because they did actually formally discuss it.
If while you're debating, Chairman, I can find the application on the system, I will let you know before I leave the meeting. Otherwise, I'll come back after the meeting on that point. Next slide, please. So if I can come back to non-material amendments, as I say, there is no requirement to consult on these. And non-material amendments are a relatively new form of application. They were introduced probably 2012 at a guess, I think it is. Before that, there was no formal procedure for agreeing changes to plans, and changes may occur for a number of reasons. It may be that the applicant has changed his mind about how he wants to do something. It may be that he's got planning permission, he's gone to get building regs, and oh dear, he can't comply with building regs, so he's got to move a window or change something on the scheme. So the non-material amendment process was brought in, if you like, to formalise dealing with those types of changes. And I would add, I think the scale of what can be accepted as a non-material amendment will be different depending on the scale of the development. Clearly, on a householder scheme, it will be less than if we're dealing with an application for 100 houses, for instance. This was one request we had, and you can see on the left was what we approved, and on the right is what they came back with. And I think you would agree that is, in my view, materially different in appearance to what was approved. It also had different impacts on the neighbouring property, because although it's only a minor chamfer on the edges, it brought the back of the property out further, quite close to the boundary with the neighbouring property, and therefore had a greater impact on that neighbouring property. So we rejected that one as a non-material amendment on the basis that it was materially different and had greater impact on the amenities of the neighbour. Next screen, please. This is one which we did agree as a non-material amendment. So actually, I've got those around the wrong way.
That's great.
I do apologise. I've got my labelling around the wrong way. The one on the right is what we actually approved. So you can see in that rear elevation of that extension on the left, there is a 2-pane window. And on the right, on the left, there is a full glazed window. So that was one which we felt didn't materially change the scheme or the impacts on neighbours. It's on the back, it's not visible from the public realm, and the impacts on neighbours in terms of overlooking would not have been significantly different from the window that you can see on the approved scheme. So that was agreed as a non-material amendment. And I think last slide, just to highlight on conservation areas, I said I wouldn't go into this in detail, but I just wanted to emphasise that we do treat conservation areas very seriously. There is a statutory duty imposed on us. So this is more than just applying policy. Section 72 of Planning Listed Building and Conservation Areas Act imposes a statutory duty on us to have, as you can see on the screen there, special regard to conservation areas and the desirability for preserving or enhancing the character or appearance of that area. As I say, I'm not going to dwell on that because conservation areas is subject to a separate scrutiny item. So next slide, please. And traditional questions, or hand it over to you, Chairman, for debates and questions.
Thank you very much indeed. I wasn't checking actually. I don't know. Was the order in which you presented those slides, did they follow the order of the... They did?
You should have me, Chairman.
Oh, thank goodness for that. It's almost as though it's been planned. Right. Okay. Just something did come up when you were talking about the enforcement, and yes, I appreciate and I understand that bit about if you have a lot of enforcement, successful enforcement notices, then yes, is that a failure or is that just intransigence? And it could be perhaps one or the other.
Chairman, just to actually pick up on that, and I should say that we do have a corporate initiative which is called Getting Tougher, and it involves planning enforcement working alongside neighbourhoods. And when we get, because sometimes when we get a breach, there's more than one regime that's involved. So it could be, for instance, there might be an environmental health aspect to it, and we need to obviously identify the best course of action to take to deal with the breach of either planning or environmental health, because one way or the other we'll get them. So we have got that initiative, and we have served quite a few enforcement notices. And I think when was it? Well, it was a development at the back of here. Probably it might have been pre-pandemic, but we served the first temporary stop notice that this council had ever served on the development at the back, because they were piling and causing noise and disturbance and cracking in properties and things like that. So, or alleged cracking. I can't say it was caused by the piling. I have to be careful. So again, we do have that initiative about getting tougher, and as I say, we won't hesitate where we think it's right. We won't hesitate to serve a notice and take action. So, thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much indeed. Can I just also, hopefully members will be able to think of some questions and queries. Can you just talk about the resources involved? Obviously, I know we have heard as members, and officers have told us, and it's pretty plain to see, there is an issue about availability of planning officers, the number of officers available to work on planning applications, etc. And I think we all are very aware that that is a problem. It doesn't stop the public or whoever, applicants, still maybe having a go at members and saying, why is the council taking so long to do this, to do that? It's just a general question, really. Do you have any particular comments about the resources and how that's given? I'm fully aware there's a shortage of planning officers, fully aware of that. What magic wands have we got available?
Chairman, I'm going to hand over to Mr. Ashcroft in a moment, because that's something he's been dealing with during my absence. I would say, and add, you've already touched on it, it's not unique to Rushcliffe. All of the authorities, and there's another in Nottinghamshire that I'm aware of, a smaller team. They have 4 planning officers in the team. The last I heard, 3 of those posts were filled by agency workers, and they were trying to recruit to the 4th post. So that gives you an idea of the scale of the problem. But I will, if I can, hand over to Mr. Ashcroft, and he will enlighten you in terms of some of the detail of what we've been doing at Rushcliffe.
Yeah, Mr. Ashcroft.
Chairman, thank you. And I think that probably over the last 12 months, we've been through what some would regard as a mini perfect storm, to the extent that, as Andrew has said, Rushcliffe experienced a very significant increase in the number of planning applications. We found ourselves in a position when some of our long-standing staff decided to use their experience and get jobs elsewhere. And also we found that with COVID, people were getting used to working from home and not within the usual team spirit and environment in which they were. So I think as most members know, that meant that 2 things were happening at the same time. First, we built up quite a significant backlog of planning applications, which were either in need of being determined in the statutory period or had gone beyond that. What we were also finding is that people, and in particular agents, were becoming very dissatisfied with the level of service that they were facing. For a authority that's dealing with around 3,000 planning applications a year, there should always be around 400 applications that are in the system at any one time. If you were to start from scratch with a new planning service and you were expected to determine applications within 8 weeks, it would only be the time you got to the 8th week that you'd be starting to determine the ones that came in on day 1. So there's always applications around, but we've gone beyond that normal threshold. We've now recovered, both in terms of the number of applications going through in 8 weeks and 13 weeks. And as Andrew has said, because of the revised arrangements that we put in place in November, we've continued and consolidated, hopefully, with our engagement with yourselves as members and with town and parish councils. But we've also consolidated and significantly improved our engagement with them, which was the area that we were really struggling with. In other words, those people who were submitting planning applications and not getting any direct feedback. Rushcliffe is in the fortunate place that we still have a well-established substantive team of officers. We do have agency staff. Through the graciousness of the council has allowed us to employ more agency staff than we had 6 months ago, simply to attempt to balance up this mismatch between resources and the number of applications. And that's helped us to recover in terms of the number of applications going through in the statutory period. If by way of example, you would go to some authorities in London and the South East, you would find that 75% to 100% of officers were agency staff, which creates very significant issues in terms of longevity and understanding planning histories. So we are in the very fortunate place there. Inevitably, authorities like Rushcliffe use agency staff as a balancing pond almost, so that you're taking them on in the peaks and letting them fall away in the troughs of workload. We are still in that peak of workload, and therefore we're holding on to the agency staff, which I think has been helpful. I can report that over the last week or so, we've been successful in recruiting an additional substantive member of staff. We currently have 3 vacancies for substantive posts. We now have 2. And I think the really encouraging thing with the most recent appointment is the very positive feedback we got about working conditions in Rushcliffe, and actually the range and the nature and the type of applications that a planning officer will be dealing with. So actually that's quite a strong selling point. What you've heard from Andrew is exactly right, though, that this is a national problem. Allegedly, there are now only 80% of planning officers in the country to what the country needs. And actually, this isn't just a problem for local planning authorities. There are many planning consultancies and agencies with whom I speak who share that same problem, and they are having exactly the same problem of recruiting their own staff. So effectively, we're all chasing the same people in the same pond, and that creates its own tensions. But I'm happy to report that we have consolidated the mismatch between capacity and workloads. I'm also happy to report that I think some of that team spirit and happiness that existed up to about 12 months ago is now probably coming back. And as people come back more regularly into the office, I think you can see that element of a vibrant team again. And I think the one thing that has always impressed me since I've been here is that strength and purpose of the planning team. And that remains there. Plainly, it's been slightly battered around the edges the last 9 months or so because of that workload and the pressures that it puts on people. So hopefully that gives you a flavour, Chairman.
Yeah, thanks for that. Just a couple of quick supplementaries. One, presumably as a general question, I assume that they're often attracted away by higher salaries in other areas, maybe in private practice or whatever, which presumably that's a problem. Also, I'm assuming the problem is to a certain extent self-defeating, because if you get more non-determinations, does that itself create extra work to deal with the non-determinations? So, as I say, it's self-defeating because that in itself means more work.
And on the first point, we've done some recent benchmarking about the salaries here in Rushcliffe and compared them with other local salaries. And it looks as though we're competing reasonably well. And in fairness to our staff, I think there's a variety of issues why people work in Rushcliffe. And I think one of the key elements of Rushcliffe is that it's a good place to work. Quality of life is good. Working conditions are good. So plainly, people might be attracted by the salary, but in many cases, people are influenced by a whole range of other factors. So I think we always need to bear that in mind. Chairman, I think you're right that at times there can be the attraction of a higher salary working in the private sector. But with that comes its own different challenges. And also many of our long-standing staff are perhaps used to working for local authorities and are embedded in the local government pension scheme and issues of that nature, which brings its own attractions and counter issues. On the second issue, you're exactly right that the planning services have got itself into a place where it was becoming a vicious cycle, to the extent that applications that weren't being determined in time were creating phone calls for either myself or Leanne or other people, and therefore we were all chasing our tails. And part of the issue was as well that even agency staff had left for whatever reason, we were then having to replace them, and new staff were picking up old cases. And that's one of the reasons why we introduced the arrangements in November. So at least every agent was getting a phone call either when a new application was 5 weeks old or on the older ones, at least after the case officer had come to terms with his or her new caseload, they were updating the agent on where they were. And we found that whilst that hasn't completely reduced, as it were, the default phone calls, semi-complaints that come to myself or others, at least in the vast majority of cases now, professional agents know and are expecting their phone call after 5 weeks. What we are also, and what we have retained exceptionally high standards, is that we are very good at the beginning and the end of the process. At times, the end of the process has sometimes been beyond 8 weeks, but we are still registering applications within 2 or 3 working days, which is government best practice. And when Andrew or I or the principals are signing off the decisions, the decision notice in most cases going out on the same day. It would be wrong for me to mention names, but there are some authorities elsewhere in the country that it's taking them sometimes up to 6 weeks to register a planning application. And in some cases, as Andrew says, there are now authorities that's taking them more than the 8 weeks simply to register the application. So some authorities are in crisis. In our case, we still maintain that excellent beginning and the end of the process. I would be the first to acknowledge that the professional planning team has struggled in the middle over the last 9 months, but fair play to the business support unit that have kept the beginning and the end going extremely well.
Thank you very much indeed, Councillor Butler.
Thank you. Could I pick up on that? You've just talked about the success we're having in recruiting new planning, and you specifically said planning officers. How does that include enforcement? Because we have had problems with enforcement, both in terms of the number of cases that either have been reported to us or we've picked up and then reported to you, and as a result of that, there was frantic discussion going on there, and as a result of that, have we perhaps missed the boat at all on any particular enforcement queries and problems we've had over the last few months?
Sorry, I apologise. Maybe if I give the general answer, Andrew can fill in on some details. But actually, I suppose I bring the advantage that I've seen how different authorities elsewhere have worked. Certainly in the last 6 years since I left substantive local government, and plainly, any head of planning, if he or she was given more money, almost without exception, they put it into enforcement, because it's a real frontline area, and it's the traditional area where members always feel that a planning service either might be failing or could do more. In all the time that I've been here, I think I've been very fortunate that I don't think the enforcement team has ever really struggled properly to handle an issue. I think we're now in the very fortunate place that we've now managed to bring back James Bate, who's heading up the enforcement team. We've got 2 very good proactive enforcement officers, and almost without exception, if I ask for anything to be investigated, I get an email on the same day, yes, we're doing it, and then I get an email back the following day saying that it's been done. So actually, I see here far more proactive enforcement taking place than I've seen elsewhere. And I think we're in the very fortunate place that we've got 2 very senior and experienced enforcement officers who are doing a really good job. Just before I hand over to Andrew, I entirely concur with Andrew's view that you play enforcement entirely on its merits and entirely on the case. So I think Rushcliffe has got it right, that where we need to be tough, we need to be tough, and we can demonstrate that we can be tough. It'd be wrong for me to mention where this case is, but we've dealt with a fairly high profile case over the last 10 days where we are ready, where necessary, to serve a temporary stop notice, but we haven't done so because of very high level and quick involvement. We've nipped the issue in the bud, and with the consent of the developer concerned, they have agreed to stop works on the offending plots. So effectively, we've done it by a different mechanism. What matters is the outcome, not the process that you use to achieve that outcome. So my take on your enforcement service is that it's in the top quartile of effectiveness.
Just to pick up on the point that Mr. Ashcroft made at the end there, the other issue is if we had served a temporary stop notice and the developer had breached that temporary stop notice, we still can't bring it to a halt. We have to go to court because it's then an offence under the temporary stop notice to carry on. and the courts can't bring it to a halt. All they can do is impose a fine or possibly a daily fine. So it's just that deterrent to try and stop the developer doing what they're doing, basically. There was two things I was going to say. The one thing I can remember is that I think, I'm trying to rack my brains now, it's probably early 2019 or early 2020, we had a review of the service done in terms of resources and capacity. In respect of the enforcement service, the review showed that the capacity and the resources was about right for an authority of our size and the number of cases that we dealt with. And again, if you are an authority that is consistently banging out enforcement notices on the day one of an investigation, you're going to generate more work for yourself. So it's about trying to avoid that additional workflow as well. The other point I've just remembered I was going to mention is that we've got the enforcement policy, which we adopted a couple of years ago now. And again, that policy did change to a certain extent how we prioritize cases. So we had a situation, and I can't remember how it came about now, but it was probably a bit unrealistic, and the sort of expectations on the staff was probably too much, where every enforcement case would be inspected within 1 day of receipt of the complaint. Now, clearly, there are certain cases where we do need to get out and inspect on the day of, or within 1 day. So if someone's knocking a listed building about or chopping down a protected tree, we need to be out there promptly. If someone's put a fence up in a back garden situation that's 3 inches too high, do we really need to go out the day after we had the complaint? So we do prioritise them, and it will depend on, to a certain extent, also where it is, not just the nature of the breach. Again, if it's in a conservation area, we'll give it a higher profile. But again, that has helped the 2 officers that we've got deal with and prioritise their workload so they can be more on top of it. Thank you, Chairman.
Right. Can I ask, is anybody, sorry, Councillor Phillips, just another false start.
I should have said while I have the floor, which I sometimes do, just to come back on those poultry houses. Yes, we did consult Cropwell Bishop Parish Council. Well, it's certainly showing that they were consulted anyway on the list, along with Kenilton Parish Council. Okay. Thank you, Chairman.
Right, thank you. Councillor Phillips.
Thank you, Chairman. I just wanted to go back. You mentioned that we've got enough agency staff within the pool to ride out any peaks and troughs. The way things are going with high inflation, interest rates and cost of building materials, we might suddenly see a falling off of applications. So do we still have enough sort of flex in the system by maybe offloading agency staff and still retaining our good staff, finding them other things to do until things pick up again, if that's what happens?
Whoever. If I just say Andrew, then I'm not going to be wrong, am I?
Mr. Ashcroft can start, and I'd like to add a little bit, perhaps, to what, depending on what he says, what's said.
And I think the very short and mechanical answer to that question is yes. We can turn on or turn off agency staff as we see fit. Most of the agency staff come with us on a 3-month fixed-term contract. Most of the contracts give us the flexibility of extending that contract for further 3 months or for whatever period we like. But in extremis, those contracts can be terminated within 2 weeks. So if the caseload dramatically dropped off, which I don't think it will, but I think you're right, that it seems as though the country is perhaps drifting towards an area where investment may not be as high as we anticipated, then we can wind down that agency staff resource. So plainly, what most intelligent authorities are doing, and hopefully we fall comfortably into that category, is that we've got a base core of staff who we trust, who understand how the restrictive system works, and we top it up with agency staff where necessary. Given our recent success in recruiting an additional substantive member of staff, ideally we'd like to fill the other 2 vacant posts, which naturally would cause us to reduce our reliance on agency staff. Thank you.
Chairman, if I can just add to that, and I think part of Councillor Phillips, if I interpret it right, Councillor Phillips' question was, if we got rid of all the agency staff, would we have trouble keeping our core staff busy, or would we have to find them work to do? All I can do is speak from experience, and I came here in 2009. In all that time, I've never known a situation where we've been looking for the next application or kicking our heels to find the next piece of work. Year on year, we have consistently exceeded our budget income, and this year I think it's astronomical, to be quite honest. So no, I don't think we would struggle. And the way that, as Andrew, the other Andrew has alluded, we would do it on almost like a framework basis. So you have your core staff, they are working all the time with us, and then when you need to bring in those staff, you go to the framework and you bring those people in to top up. But as I say, it's never been quiet in Rushcliffe all the time I've been here.
We need to keep you busy, that's why. Councillor Upton.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to sort of keep my comments on a very high level strategic point, really, because I'm not an expert in the detailed regulations of the planning system, but I think I'm focusing on the planning approval process rather than the enforcement in my comments. And I think I'm understanding that at the front end, where you validate the applications, the message seems to be we're doing pretty well. And at the back end or the end of the process, we're doing pretty well. And given that there's a shortage of qualified staff nationally and the increasing numbers of applications, both for the large sites and the smaller sites, extensions, possibly working from home and the like. So demand applications are at best the same or potentially rising, and the public and the developers want to know more and more communication, then it's the bit in the middle, I suspect, the actual processing of the applications, be they large or small, is possibly where there are efficiencies to be made, for want of a better word. And I always come back to sort of a challenge, really. Is there a way to review working practices? Are we doing the reports and the appraisals of these applications the way that we've always done them, because that's the way we've always done them and nobody likes change, and why would you want to change it? Well, somebody said, let's have a blank piece of paper, a pretty big root and branch review of how we write those reports, because from my perspective, on a number of occasions, I have been given 100 and 150 sheets of A4, fairly technical. I'm getting some smiles across the floor here. You know, most councillors, including myself, are not town and country planning professionals. We have a little bit of knowledge, and a little bit of knowledge can be a dangerous thing. And I'm all for plain language and plain English. And in another world, I've seen on complicated reports a brief executive summary in plain English, which I read it, no more than a side of A4, and that gives me an outline of what it's all about, the key issues, and perhaps the recommendation. And then if I want to turn over 2 or 3 sides of A4, I get a little flavour of the detail. But if I want to go about all the detail in the chapter verse of the national planning framework and local plan, part this and subsection that, I can hit a button that takes me to an appendix. Or if I'm bored or want some bedtime reading or have insomnia, then I can click on that and it might get me to sleep. So I'm saying, could we think about looking at that middle bit of the sandwich? Is there a case for a template to be made and standard phraseology? I'll stop there, Chairman.
Chairman, I think I'll start, and I've sensed that Mr. Ashcroft may want to add. We've already commented, or Mr. Ashcroft did, that we have a core team of planners. Some of those planners have been with us for many years. There's a double-edged sword to that, because yes, I think to a certain extent you can get stuck in a rut and you can just carry on doing things the way you've done them for many years. I think the benefit of, Andrew Ashcroft is here for a purpose. We've also got Phil Cook, who has been with us for a couple of years now. And the benefit of having those people with us, even for me, I will admit, is that they come in with fresh ideas and they bring in ideas about how things have been done elsewhere. No, we haven't done a root and branch review, and I think part of that is due to the workloads we had. Having said that, one of the tasks that I was doing Obviously, I apologise for reasons you will know it didn't get completed, but we were looking at the report structure. We already changed it several years ago. We do have a template. And what I was encouraging officers to do is less is more to a certain extent. If you take the policy section of a report as an example, some officers were regurgitating the whole of a policy in the policy section and then repeating it in the appraisal section when they were assessing the application. What I was encouraging, and perhaps Andrew can tell me if it's happening or not from reading reports, is simply list the policies. Our policies are on the website. All councillors have access to the policies on the website or in the development plans. So I do like the idea of clicking on a link, a sort of active link. That's something we could do potentially. But as I say, yes, it's something that I started, hasn't been completed, but there were moves to try and reduce the length of the report, because clearly when you get one a week before planning committee and you've got to read 150 pages, I know how long it takes because I've read those reports before it goes out to you guys. So clearly, yes, anything we can do to shorten the reports and help you will help the process, I think. Andrew.
Chairman, when I first came, within a few weeks, we had a big team meeting whilst Andrew was still around. And Leanne asked me just to give a summary of the service as a context to how we would try to change it and drive it forward. And I remember two key elements of the summary were really good team spirit and also professionally very sound and want to be seen to be doing a good job. So the technical quality and standards of the team is very high. But I acknowledge that that can be a disadvantage, and for exactly the purposes that members have been discussing. And plainly, I know half of us were in the planning committee last week when you had a lot to read and a lot of details on each of those items, when there were probably some key bullet points that simply needed to be highlighted to members. So where I think we've got to, as we've stabilised the service and as we've got the staff in place to be able to cope with the workload, it's almost as though this then becomes the next phase of the task. Because plainly, I think members are picking up, as Andrew and I have picked up, that if officers are spending a disproportionate amount of time writing up a report for the planning committee, it takes a disproportionate amount of time for the principal officers and Andrew and I to check it. It takes a disproportionate amount of time for you to read it. And you then start to factor what is the cost of that. Members will smile even more at this point that I'm going to make, but you're only seeing the tip of the iceberg. We see that quality and that level of detail on the delegated stuff. So the big bulk of the iceberg, 97% of everything that you don't see is of an equivalent standard. So therefore it's taken up an equivalent amount of time. So that's probably the next fertile area, because it plainly has an impact on the capacity of the service. We've got the numbers right, you pardon the expression, we've got the bums on seats, but we now need to make that capacity even more efficient and streamlined. So I think that's the next big challenge. But as Andrew Pegram says, it's changing cultures that are fairly ingrained. And that's not a criticism of those cultures. It's just, we're all used to what we're doing. And I will be the first to acknowledge that I'm used to what I'm doing. And everybody's used to doing that. But I think it's how we do that, because that will inevitably make people's lives easier and more efficient. So I think both Mr. Pegram and I are agreed that that's the next challenge.
Yeah, great. Okay, thanks for that. Councillor Mrs. Stockwood.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, following on from what Councillor Upton's been saying, it's the end product as we present on the committee that's our public face, really. And it's been good to see different officers giving those presentations. However, the level of competency has been variable, let's put it that way. And
could I just ask you, is that in the actual presentation skill, or is that in the technical expertise?
It's the presentation skill that I'm talking about. I think we smiled at one another, Mr. Ashcroft, the other day when I think he was an agency staff was giving a presentation, which it went on and on, let's put it that way. We've also had an officer in the past that went through every point on a very lengthy presentation on the report, went through every part of it. It's not necessary. We have, as members of the committee, spent hours looking at it, going through it, and trying to anticipate, especially as the deputy to Roger, that what the queries will be. So we have looked at it in detail. I think in the past, before we changed the system, I mean, I've been on since 99, and in those days were 25 members, weren't they? Can you remember, Councillor Clark? We're down to 11 now, and personally, I think it sometimes is difficult when substitutes don't turn up for perfectly valid reasons and things. So I am concerned about our public face, which people are, listening to now and watching us. And I like a level of professionalism that's really, even-handed. I don't suppose, given the difficulties you've had, that it can be explained to those presenting for the first time, perhaps, that this is the way you should present it, because that would take quite some time. But it is an element to me that is missing sometimes. And I'm only talking about occasionally, but it's those that stand out to the public and committee members. Thank you.
Thank you.
Briefly, I would say I'm really grateful that those comments have been made. Thank you. And we discussed in our management team meeting this morning the planning committee last week. I thought it would be wrong for me to go into details of that. But I think you're right, that because of changeover of staff and because we actively encourage case officers to do their presentation, because inevitably they know the case better than anyone else. But inevitably, we've got different people with different levels of competence, knowledge, and indeed, as you say, presentational skills. So I recognise that we need to raise the bar there and get a good level standard there. Because I'm with you that effectively the planning committee is the shop window of the planning service. And it's probably, I say this quite respectfully to other elements of the service, but it's probably the shop window of the council, because you get far more members of the public turning up to the planning committee meeting than any other meeting. So it is important. And also, I recognise that some of the speakers, some of the applicants and the agents come with their own professional standards and will make their own assessment. So we clearly need to do that. I think that the interesting thing has been, and it reflects on how efficiently the delegated system works, because here so few applications are coming through to the planning committee. It's perhaps subliminal that officers are thinking, well, we've got more time to give a big presentation. Whereas Mr. Pegram and I can remember back in our joint days on the Isle of Wight when we would be regularly dealing with 20 to 25 planning applications in an evening. And therefore, by definition, the presentations had to be short and swift. Otherwise, you would be there all day and all night. So it's a different culture and concept. But I take your point. We'll take that back to the team and try and get those presentations slick and sharp within the acknowledgement. And I'm grateful for your acknowledgement that members have read the reports in detail. So therefore, you want a summary of the key elements so that you can then ask questions. Thank you, Chairman.
Chairman, just make a very quick point I'll make, if I may. And that is that I think the attendance at planning committee, I've always encouraged officers to come and present. I think attendance at planning committee helps them write their reports. Coming back to your point, Councillor Upton, because if they see the way that the committee operates and the type of questions that are asked, they can put it into the report. The other point is, which has helped us in getting officers along to committee, is obviously the move in committee from the evening to a 2:30 start, which has helped facilitate having the officers upstairs if they come down, if they need to report, and then go back upstairs and carry on with their work. So just to highlight that point.
Just a related point to that, in terms of you're talking about it helps the officers look at applications, and I emphasise I'm not talking about the conduct of the actual planning committee itself. So it's not a question of engendering, you treat each application on its merits. I'm talking about at the earlier stage where officers are looking at and assessing applications. What does concern me, having been a councillor for an awfully long time, is corporate memory. And officers, if you bring in agency staff all the time, they won't have, let's say they were all agency staff, they wouldn't have a clue as to what's happened in the past. As I say, I'm not talking about the consideration of the committee, I'm just talking about assessment of the application. So what can we do to engender that corporate memory so that officers in general are aware of what may have happened in the past?
Chairman, I think part of that, again, is, we're lucky we have got some officers who have been here for many years. Having said that, you can't nail their feet to the floor. If they want to leave and go to another authority, clearly that's their decision. I think part of our success is that we have some quite senior officers in the team who have been around for a long time, and there is that checking process and validating process that goes on. So it's not just down to the case officer. There's obviously someone like myself or the principal officer looking over their shoulder, checking things when they do them. I think the other aspect is about keeping good records. We do have a particularly good system now, the DMS system that we use, and I encourage all officers to upload everything, even if it's an email to somebody, upload that email onto the DMS system. Then when somebody else comes in and picks up a subsequent application and the original case officer may not be around, you can go back to the history and you can see what happened. So hopefully, between the sort of experience we have in the team and the recording of information, we will retain that corporate memory. But I agree with you, it is something that is difficult to keep hold of.
So I'll just add to that with a smile on my face. There are 4 or 5 members of our staff who are so critical to our corporate memory and our longevity and our management structure that if I had the ability to do so, I'd have a fleet of cars bringing them to the office and taking them home every night to keep them safe. because you can lose agency staff around the margins, but it's the core of your management structure that is absolutely critical, and it's the core of your management structure that's kept this service ticking over for the last 2 or 3 years and is the safeguard for its future.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Upton, you want to come back?
Thank you, Chairman. I just wanted to pick up, I understand what Councillor Stockwood says about the new case officers we've had presenting at Planning Committee. And yes, I hear what she says, but from my own perspective, I do welcome it. I think it gives these officers a continuing professional development. It gives them experience. And I understand that if you've never been to a committee before, ever in your working life, then frankly, it could be almost, well, from personal experience, quite frightening until you get used to that and the committee. So I do hope that it carries on. I think it's down to training, perhaps, and giving confidence to some of those people that naturally don't like presenting and speaking in public. Some of us are gifted that way, others aren't. The other brief point I wanted to make was, well, I remember it, over 90%, I think we say, are delegated decisions. And I'm going back to my earlier comments about, I have read those reports from time to time. So, okay, I look at the ones that go to committee, but equally I do quite often look at the delegated reports, and I think there's scope there as well, because they are quite detailed, almost as much as some of the ones that come to committee from time to time, on quite small items. And I think, I can understand the professional would like to do, why would they not, the best job they can do. And you have a pride in the work that you do, and you think, that's really good. I enjoy doing that. It's a professional piece of work. It reads well. And if it ever goes to a planning inspector on an appeal, well, I've covered most of my work anyway. So there's a number of issues there, but that's where I'm trying to pick up on 2 issues. I like the new people presenting at committee, and there's the delegated reports that perhaps could be looked at as well.
Thank you, Chairman. Actually, I've got 2 small points to make, not just one. But firstly, we'll look at the reports and we'll look at how we can streamline them. We have to be mindful, and again, I've heard you say this, Councillor Upton, we are quasi-judicial. And there's also always the risk of someone challenging us or going to the ombudsman. And we had a case a little while ago where we had no fault found with us by the ombudsman, but he did make a comment saying the report could have been a bit more detailed in these areas. So we're trying to shorten the reports. And just to make you laugh, when I first arrived and I was looking at some of the reports that were written back in 2008-9 maybe, one of them was been to site, looks okay, approval, and that was it. The good old days maybe. The other point is I take on board your comments about training. Not that long ago I did organise and we facilitated a presentation skills training, and all the officers attended that. I was not part of the course, I was there as an overseer. I got browbeaten into giving a presentation, and one of the officers commented, "How do you follow that?" So sorry to put a feather in my cap, but that was the response. But as you've alluded to, not everyone is comfortable walking into a room of people, especially if there's 50 people at the back on a very complex application and delivering a presentation and answering questions. So thank you.
Yes, well, I think you are well commended from many quarters on your presentation. So I don't think you need to be worried about that at all.
I'm not aiming to do them. Leave it to the officers.
Right, I'm conscious, actually, time is going away very, very quickly. So I think what I ought to do is just to try and get a bit of order. Is there anybody in section 4, well, the service standards and communication? Because just as a general comment, I think this report, a lot of queries that have previously been made, and if I've in inverted commas, I'll use the word complaints, but observations, if you like, concerns that have been expressed. I think we're all agreed around the table. A lot of those concerns are actually addressed in this report. So perhaps it's not quite as hard going, if you like, as it might have been. Is there anything in the service standards and communication section which Councillor Comblight, did you want to?
I just want to follow up on what you've just said, that many of the items have been addressed, as was pointed out in the presentation. And interestingly, only yesterday, I received an email on an application that is in my ward, and it was a 5-week update on the application with the issues that are still outstanding and need answering. And that was, I just thought that was excellent and extremely helpful. It came to me, didn't go to the parish council. Now, I'm going to say is it possible that this can be put in as a norm, and this communication does go to the ward councillors and the parish council, because we can disseminate that to concerned residents who think, oh, as has been said, that's all fallen into a black hole, nothing's happening, why isn't anybody listening? And this was just so helpful. So if the officer was Matt Hilton, so if you want to, and the application numbers 2200398. But I won't give you any more information. I'm trying to keep it, not make it personal, but yes.
You've marked his card now. Right, in that case, let's move on to the next section, which relates to application and planning policy. And I'm going to raise a question about that. I think probably paragraph 4.9 probably prompts it the most. What I think members have been concerned, does slightly concern me, is that there have been occasions where it seems to have been implied that planning officers have, if you like, they've determined what a policy should be rather than implemented the policy of the council. Locally in my village, there were some bungalow or bungalows, one or the other. And anecdotally, it was reported back to me that the architect or the planning agents had been told that a bungalow would not be acceptable. We don't do bungalows. It's got to be a house, when the applicant had originally applied for a bungalow. So I just wonder, what safeguards do we have that planning officers are not determining policy rather than implementing policy?
Chairman, I'll start by saying that the role of the planning officer and indeed the planning committee, any decision maker in the process, is to apply the policies that we have. And it is down to then, in some cases, a matter of interpretation of that policy, and also, as I alluded to earlier, the weight that you give to the varying issues. If you think of it as a big stew pot, you throw the policy in with all the material considerations, stir it round, and you come to a conclusion about how you're going to recommend that application. I am familiar with the case that you referred to, and I would be concerned if it was the agent or the developer was told they had to do something. What we do is negotiate with people and discuss proposals with people. I'm not going to go into the details of that scheme, clearly, because it'd be wrong in this meeting, but clearly that would have been the process. It would have been presented to us as a scheme. We would have looked at the policies and we would have then negotiated what we thought would have been an appropriate outcome to that application. So it's it's applying the policy rather than determining what the policy should be effectively. There are schemes, obviously, where we consult our policy team on the bigger schemes in particular. So we'll seek the views of our policy team on their interpretation and application of that policy. And at the end of the day, as it says in that 4.9, no person has unilaterally a right to approve a planning application at Rushcliffe. There are checks and balances. So the case officer only makes a recommendation. It's then down to people like Mr. Ashcroft, myself, and the principals to look at that report, see if we think they've got it right, and then if we're happy with it, sign it off. I have, and I'm not afraid to throw one back at an officer and say, have another look at this because I think you've got it wrong. And I even on one case, not here, I even on one case offered to do the appeal if there was a subsequent appeal, and we actually won the appeal. So, as I say, it's about negotiating, and there are checks and balances and validation processes in the process. And I don't know if Mr. Ashcroft wants to add any more to that.
Anything else? Anybody? Councillor Barney.
Quick comment on 4.7, where it talks about the underlying strategies that underpin planning policy, neighbourhood plans. I've observed communities go to great lengths and parish councils to produce neighbourhood plans, put in hours and hours of work, the plan be adopted and voted and ratified, all wonderful, and then seen it have no power at all in terms of what actually gets built, because people go to appeal and win, and the planning inspectorate doesn't consider any weight towards the neighbourhood plan. But still, the great hope for the neighbourhood plan is in housing mix and be achieved with housing mix. And then yet again, we see the developer come forward and say, having considered initially the neighbourhood plan housing mix, say, sorry, it's not affordable. And then come back and then Rushcliffe go with. So again, the weight of the neighbourhood plan seems to be lost. The question is there any point in neighbourhood plans going forward for communities like Sutton Bonington who don't have one? Should they be bothering to put the time and effort in to achieve one?
Bear in mind that
quick answer.
Very quick answer. As some members know, I'm a examiner of neighbourhood plans, and also I was on the steering group for the production of a neighbourhood plan in my former home village. So I know quite a bit about neighbourhood plans. And as Andrew's slide showed earlier, once a neighbourhood plan is made, it becomes part of the development plan, and therefore planning decisions have to give very significant weight to it. There have been very recent cases in the High Court where some planning decisions have been quashed, where the local planning authority didn't adequately take account of the neighbourhood plan. So the short answer to your question is yes, there's every point. And also, I think now parishes preparing neighbourhood plans are in the very fortunate place at this point, because national planning policy is very fresh. the latest update of the NPPF was last July. Our local plan part 1 and part 2 are still relatively fresh, relatively up to date. It's a classically good time to produce a neighbourhood plan, because part of the testing of the neighbourhood plan against the basic conditions is that it has to have regard to national policy and has to be in general conformity with the policies in the development plan. The first wave of neighbourhood plans came forward when this authority and other neighbourhood plans and other local authorities were producing their local plans, and therefore that context wasn't set. Here it is very, very much so. So I think we're in the fortunate place where neighbourhood plans can really move forward. There was some useful discussion at the planning committee last week about the weight that you would give to a neighbourhood plan. And I know some members were slightly frustrated about the officer recommendation and probably the outcome of that application. But hopefully their members were balancing a whole range of issues, and in particular were balancing the age of the neighbourhood plan and the age of its evidence. And therefore that was allowing members to come up to that balanced decision based on all the policies in the development plan. So the golden rules are, yes, get your neighbourhood plan, get it as up to date as possible, and get it to dovetail into the local plan and national planning policy framework, and therefore it will be really effective. Chairman, hopefully that was the short and sharp answer to what could have been a very long answer.
A bit shorter next time, please. Right, so thanks for that. Let's move on to the consultation process. Any particular comments on the consultation process?
Yes, so I've got
Councillor Butler.
Thank you. A couple actually. First of all, I learned something from this report. If you look in paragraph 4.11, and that is about the site notices that go on to on application sites, which we're all familiar with. We've all seen them. But I genuinely didn't know that the applicant is expected to remove them afterwards. And I wonder as well, having seen the number of planning of notifications that are still up even after a house or whatever has been built, I'm wondering whether the applicant knows they're supposed to remove it. And surely is it not beyond the realms of us when we're out and about doing other visits or whatever? Can we not, when I say we, I mean officers, remove them, or indeed I suppose it's not members removing them if the application has been determined. So I was just curious about that aspect. And also something you said, Mr. Ashcroft, a little while ago about consultation with neighbours, which I know I hear what we're saying about the guidance and the policies and all the rest of it. But you said something very interesting. You said that also officers can decide which neighbours are informed. Could there not be a role for members there? Because members know the area very well, and also members will be very familiar, no doubt, with the likely views and comments of not just them as members, but also the people they're representing, the neighbours and other interested parties. So could there not be a little bit of a two-way street here for us to help with? Does that make sense?
Perhaps if I could just add a little supplementary to that, and it relates to the same sort of issue, is depending on the it's more of a commercial application. And I can't help but say, if I say helicopters, that covers an impact on a much wider area, doesn't it? So how do you determine, and who determines how widespread you go? Wherever that might be flying, it's going to impact on a wider parish area.
I'll take the easy part first, Chairman. The site notices. Firstly, there is an advisory on the bottom of all the decision notices that basically says, part of it says, if the site notice is still displayed, this should be removed by by the applicant. So there is an advisory on the decision notice. Hopefully they're reading it, because they should be aware of all their conditions as well. The other aspect is yes, when officers are out and about, if they see a mouldy oldie, they will take it down. So we do that as well. The paper that we use is a special paper, and I'm sometimes amazed at how good it's weathered and how long it lasts. But as I say, yes, we do proactively take them down. In terms of the consulting people, Chairman, you've used one example, which is a very difficult one, obviously, because yes, helicopters fly long distances and potentially have wide-ranging impacts. However, the standard response I give is that clearly the consultations that we undertake have to be proportionate to the application. Yes, there might be people in a village or somewhere who think they should be told about every application in the village, and they want to be notified of applications. Ultimately, the weight that you can give to somebody's comments depends to a large extent on where they live. So clearly, if it's a two-story extension on the back of a property, we give more weight to the comments from the neighbours, immediate neighbours, than we would from someone who lives 5 or 6 doors down, because clearly they're not arguably going to be that impacted. So I think it's a question of, as I say, ultimately it's about consulting, the consultation being proportionate to the impacts. And I would again echo or make the comment that we go above and beyond the legislative requirements. We do more than some other authorities as well. And I think we've struck, in my view, I think we have struck the right balance. The other aspect, I think we still do it, is if there's a site notice, we send it to the parish council and they put it on their wall in the town, in the village hall or the notice board or something. So hopefully that sort of responds to your comments on that.
So I think, of course, it would be quite in order, wouldn't it? I'm assuming if a ward member did see an out of date, just like your officers, if it's blatantly out of date, surely it's out of date. Or would the ward member be in contravention of anything by?
No, I think, Chairman, the key bit you need to look for is comments should be made by.
Yeah.
And as long as it's gone past that date, then it can be taken down. Even arguably, it can be taken down during the application process. Having said that, we do accept comments afterwards.
Yes,
so
I was going to say, I think there needs to be a bit of discretion.
If you take the date for comments and add, in the case of most developments, 5 or 6 weeks, you should be safe to take it down, I would have thought, without any concern.
Right, so Councillor Barney, I think, was this related?
Yes, it does. And I blame the Vice Chairman for me raising it, because I too learned something new today. I was out with fire officers and discovered that the little signs that developers put on street furniture, council-owned street furniture, to point to their quality homes or whoever, should not be there. And indeed, developers are fined. Are we allowed to take those down in the same spirit?
You're a borough officer, that's a county, so I will relieve you of that. I would suggest, and I may be wrong, so I stand to be corrected. I would suggest it's probably better if it's an officer or staff or workforce that took those signs down, rather than you being in danger of entering into some form of fisticuff or with somebody saying, "Oi, what are you taking that down for?"
Chairman, I can perhaps answer it in a more general way, because obviously fly posting is a problem in some areas. And the approach we adopted when I was on the Isle of Wight, and I can't remember if it was when Mr. Ashcroft was there with me, is that if it was, for instance, someone had put up a notice saying, advertising an event, strictly speaking, no, you can't take that notice down, was my understanding. So what we used to do was we used to put a big banner across it, and in very small letters it said, "This notice is," and then in big letters, "cancelled." So it looked like the event was cancelled. So it was a surreptitious way of dealing with the issue.
Right, Councillor Way.
Just a quick one on the notification of planning applications. The definition of near neighbours, there was a case in our village where quite a substantial development was proposed in a back garden. I have to say it didn't go ahead in the end, but it backed onto a piece of land that didn't belong to, well, I don't think you could find out who it belonged to. And then there were some other new houses behind it, and the new houses who would have been quite severely impacted by this development weren't actually informed about it. So seeing your Google Earth view of them, it gives a better impression of what places will actually be impacted. So they didn't share a boundary. So would that have been your criteria for not notifying them of it?
That would have been the criteria for not notifying them under the requirements of the legislation. However, it's then down to the judgment of the officer as to whether those people will be affected or should be notified. So, as I said earlier, if a new development takes place that's not on an ordnance survey plan, we clearly can't pick that up in the office, and there is some responsibility on the officer to use judgment and determine when they're going to do their site visit, whether there should be additional consultations.
So is that when you would be prepared to hear from ward members or parish councillors that maybe these people are relevant for the notifications?
I think we'd be more than happy. This is a team effort. Ultimately, we're all working towards the same goal. So if members feel that there's a new development that may not have been notified, if they contact the case officer or somebody and raise that query, we can look into it, certainly. So as I say, we're all trying to work to the same end result. Ultimately, you know, we're on team.
Councillor Cumberland.
Just something Councillor Ways just mentioned, and I guess the answer possibly is going to be that it'll be national planning policy. Google Earth View is very helpful. Can we not ask that applications are accompanied by a Google Earth View? I mean, we get ordnance survey maps, which sometimes are absolutely useless. Andrew Ashcroft's obviously got.
Mr. Ashcroft.
I can say Andrew's obviously got something to say.
Yeah.
This Andrew.
And I'm really pleased that that point has been raised, because the dilemma of the planning consultation system is that the system that nationally we're currently operating is little different from that which was introduced in the 1947 Town and Country Planning Act, not that I was around then, but as was translated into 1971 Act and now the 1990 Act. So effectively, we're still delivering as it were, an immediate post-war system. Was of course now, people find out through different means, as you say, Google Map is a good one, quite often, people find out about planning applications even when they're not notified because of the local WhatsApp groups or whatever. You know, so there's a whole range of mechanisms now that weren't even thought about in 1947. So we need to be more vibrant in terms of how we capture that. So as you already heard from Mr. Pegram, we do the initial consultation in the initial registration stage within the first 2 days. The case officer might then go out and find other things. Please, as members, keep in touch with the ward, with the case officer, because if he or she knows something to look at, they'll add those houses onto their additional list of consultees. But again, just to reinforce, or sorry, not to reinforce, maybe to stress the point that there are still some people nationally who feel that because they haven't had a letter, they can't comment on a planning application. That isn't the case. Having a letter doesn't give you any additional rights beyond those which anybody else has. You're in the, as Mr. Pegram has said, Rushcliffe is in the top quartile of authorities because you do everything. You do site notices, neighbour notification. Most authorities have now defaulted to site notice because it's simple and easy to do. So what I've never had since I've been here is that phone call that I've traditionally got elsewhere every week. I didn't get notified about the application, to which I say, we're not doing neighbour notifications. But then I ask the question, how did you find out about the application? Oh, because it's on a WhatsApp group or because I saw the site notice. So people find out naturally. But that person was nervous that they didn't feel they could comment because they hadn't had a letter. Nothing magical in the letter. It's just ticking a statutory box. So it's how, as a modern borough council, we engage with local people so that they know about planning applications. So whatever we can do to assist that process, we're more than willing to assist.
Okay, thanks for that. It's vaguely related to commenting on applications. I think I'm correct in saying there have been quite long delays in uploading comments onto the website. I'm assuming that's probably as a result of the staff resource situation. So maybe could we have an assurance that is that going to improve with hopefully the extra staff that you're
Chairman, I would excuse me, I would have hoped that you've seen an improvement already. Yes, it was in the first instance, it was a workload issue. We didn't used to check the comments, excuse me. They used to go on the website as soon as people made them. Unfortunately, some people put in their comments stuff which they shouldn't, and we had a complaint, a Gdpr complaint, and we had to review our process. That meant that we put unrealistic expectation on the planning officers who are dealing with all the other issues, that they would check the comments before they were released to the website, and if there was a need for any redaction, they would send it over to BSU, Business Support Unit, to get the comments that offending bits redacted. We have shifted the responsibility for checking the comments and the redaction of any information to the business support unit, taking it away from the planning officers. As I say, not because they were naughty, but purely because they just didn't have the time. And in my view, they were being expected to do something which was largely an admin process. So we think it now sits in the right area of the council. And I would hope that there have been significant improvements in the time it takes for those comments to appear on the website. Clearly, you will get situations like we've just had a bank holiday. So if someone makes their comment at 6:30 on the Thursday before the Good Friday, clearly that's not going to appear on the website until the Tuesday or Wednesday when we've come back and we've checked all the comments. But I think there is an expectation that they will go up instantly like that. The other point I would make at this point is that we don't have to put those comments on the website. There's no legislative requirement to display third-party comments on the website. We do it because we believe it helps transparency. But as I say, bottom line, and to sum up, hopefully we've now got the right process in place with the right people to ensure that that process is sped up. Thank you.
Yeah, just
Very brief one. Just a request to you as ward members. If any of your local constituents come and seek your advice on how to comment on a planning application, please tell them two things. First of all, focus only on material planning considerations. We see several letters that go well beyond that. And also, following Councillor Upton's point, less is best. So if you get a short letter that says there are 4 key material considerations here and a couple of sentences, some letters go on for a very considerable time, repeating the point. So again, that's slowing down the process. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that. I'm conscious because I want to finish at 6:30, so I'm conscious if we can really sort of start to shorten our comments down. Councillor Conroy.
Can I just say, with regard to what you've just said, in terms of members of the public understanding the planning process, which is complicated, when you send out a letter of consultation, could it not on the back have a copy of the planning process? What happens? Because, oh dear, trying to get them to understand how something gets to committee is a nightmare.
Chairman, I'd perhaps suggest an alternative approach, maybe to include in the letter a link to our website where the process is quite clearly set out, rather than trying to, because obviously we have to be mindful with things like hybrid mail, we've got to fit a certain amount of information on a page or 2, I think it might be now. So a link to the website where that information can be found, and we can review that information on the website to make sure it's clear.
Assuming everybody's got a computer, of course. Assuming everybody's got access to the internet. Councillor Butler.
Yeah, thank you. Talking of letters and documents and things on the website, I mean, generally speaking, the planning portal is good, there's no doubt, and it is good. But I think, or maybe you're going to tell me I'm wrong, but have we still got an issue at certain times when the format or the type of document that the applicant has sent in, for one reason or another, doesn't seem to work on the planning portal? Either it's not necessarily upside, not so much worried about when it's, because you very often get things upside down. Well, I know you can usually turn those around on the computer, but I'm sure I've experienced quite recently, you click on a link in the list of documents and they don't open. And as a result, that causes some frustration for me or public or whoever. But is there a danger that is going to preclude people from making comments, or certainly in time for the closure of the deadline? Because is there an issue, basically? Have we still got a problem with some people sending forms in that are not compatible or whatever with the site?
Chairman, I will have to investigate that one a little bit and ask the team, or unless Mr. Ashcroft knows the answer. I know we did have a problem with format. It's because people were uploading stuff through the planning portal and then it was coming through to us and it was either too large or in a format that couldn't be opened. Clearly, again, a bit like the previous plea, if any of you come across things like that, please let us know and we will investigate. I think they're few and far between now, but as I say, I would need to check with the team.
Good. The other, in relation, it refers to letters again, and I notice 4.19 talks about the use of the hybrid mail solution, basically outsourcing the sending of the letters, etc. So it does sort of make me a little bit nervous in terms of we're back to making sure we're notifying the right people, etc. What process is used, or how is the request made to the outsourcing company? Is it postcode, or because you could suddenly have a postcode if you're going along a street, and let's say it's an application where you've got to notify, or you decide that you would like to notify 25 people, but the postcode suddenly stops and it's another postcode that carries on, and worse than that, maybe down the white line of the road, drastic example, it's an NG postcode on one side and an LE postcode on the other side. So I worry that the system is fraught with danger with outsourcing it to, basically you're outsourcing it to a computer, aren't you?
Chairman, hopefully the short answer to that question is the hybrid company is not choosing the addresses. Effectively, we do all of that here. Our staff do that. And if you can imagine getting a mail merge or whatever, pressing print, instead of it coming out on the printer over there in this room, it comes out at the hybrid mail provider, and all they are literally doing is printing and sticking it in an envelope. So all of the technical side of it and the judgment side, if you like to call it that, is done by us here. All they're doing is printing, shoving it in the envelope. We can do checks, because I've had to do it when I've dealt with complaints. People say, oh, we didn't get our letter. We can do checks on the system, and we can check the logs to show what letters were printed and what letters were sent out by the hybrid provider. So there are, again, from that point of view as well, there's checks and balances that we can apply.
Thank you for that assurance. I was worried that we were letting decision making go outside the. Right. Any other questions? No, I think we're probably anything else under other procedural matters. As you've already indicated, we won't talk about conservation areas because that's been the subject of the previous item. I think by the look of it, I think as I indicated earlier with some earlier comments, a lot of concerns have been addressed in the report. I just wonder whether there will be a good mechanism for perhaps a light touch ongoing monitoring by this scrutiny group. And we have discussed it a little bit, maybe just that the chairman and vice chairman have a consultation process with you just as a light touch ongoing monitoring, so that any issues or concerns can be highlighted as and when they crop up. Is that something that would not be too onerous from a resource point of view?
Chairman, clearly it's for this group to make recommendations and decisions on how they want to move forward potentially. My view is, and this comes back to what I said earlier, we're all ultimately working to the same goal. And it's working together, not against each other, obviously. And I would have said that, if there are issues that arise day to day that members, and this is the whole of the membership, are concerned about, I'm more than happy that those members contact either myself, the principals, or even the case officers to highlight those issues, and we can then look into it. If you want some overview monitoring of that, then I think that potentially comes back to this group. But as I say, I think rather than leaving it the responsibility with the two of you at the moment, it should be the whole of the elected members who are there to assist us and work with us in addressing any issues that crop up as we go through, rather than saving them up and waiting for a meeting like this potentially.
Yeah, the only reason I was suggesting that was as I say, light touch, not going into any formality, but also rather than having to make it too formal and take up resources in making it a formal way, then perhaps members of the group could feed those concerns through the chairman and vice chairman and feed it through to you. So I am conscious you don't want to take up, having now had this discussion, which is, you know, being quite resource intensive, I wouldn't want to feel that you're then taking up unnecessary resources when, as you've said, we want the planning officers working on applications and not having to write another report for this group. So that's why I'm saying just light touch.
I think the important thing about that, however it's done or however it works, is about the timeliness of those comments being fed through, rather than, again, you know, if they're not made aware of a situation for 2 or 3 weeks or longer after it's occurred, like we were saying, I can't see a document on the website. We need to know about it quickly so that we can fix it. So however you decide or would wish that to be communicated to officers, it's about the timeliness of that communication more than anything.
Yeah, I'm quite happy if members are able to communicate directly with you to express concern, absolutely fine. But maybe just having that safeguard, so that if it's something more of a general nature rather than a specific, then that general concern can come through us. If it's a specific, contact you and express the concern. Councillor Butler?
Yeah, I mean, I think as the chairman and colleague has said, we've covered quite a few things this afternoon. It would be a shame for them just to be brushed aside. So perhaps we've got the recommendations, haven't we? Shall we put an additional recommendation on that says just that the group reviews the changes or items we discussed today on an ongoing basis? So members, whether they're of this group or members in general, will know to highlight any concerns with us, and then we in turn, and you will respond as quickly as you can. But at some point, we perhaps need to have an overview as to what new issues have come out and crucially, what's been done to address those issues. So perhaps have that as another sort of recommendation,
Does that
to review the process.
Well, there's a potential timeliness about this meeting is that we'd indicated that when we introduced the revised survey standards in November 2021, that we would monitor the situation and progress at the end of March, and plainly we're at and slightly beyond the end of March now. But plainly, many of the comments that have been made this afternoon have been really helpful. And if there's a mechanism whereby some members could provide us some very detailed engagement within that process, I certainly know that I'd find that helpful to the extent that you as members are bringing that input in terms of member engagement, communication, and in particular communication with your constituents and town and parish councils. Plainly, we're also taking similar soundings from applicants and agents who are plainly looking at the process from a subtly different point of view, where the principal emphasis there is timeliness and speed. But yeah, whatever role either yourself, chairman, or the vice chairman feel that they can give into that process, I'd find that very helpful.
Yeah, it's just in the spirit of engendering or encouraging keeping in touch, if you like. So I'm not for a moment suggesting any onerous or formal process, because as we've already talked about, planning officers are under tremendous pressure and they need to be dealing with planning applications. But if there's a specific general concern that we can pass on without it being too onerous or formal, then
I think it's fair to say, Chairman, that we won't know if a procedure is not being followed if somebody doesn't tell us. And if it's not being followed, we need to remind people. It might be there's a new person in the team or something, and we've overlooked telling them they've got to do it in a certain way. So yeah, if the process isn't being followed, as long as somebody tells us, we can review it.
fine. So if you're moving that,
I'm happy to move just that. So review the arrangements, and also, of course, at some future meeting of this committee, we can look back and see what differences, what changes have been made. It's a horrible expression, but what lessons have been learned as well? Bit of a cliche, but I think it's probably quite relevant. So, if everyone's happy.
And I'll second that. Does that find favour around the table? Yep.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll take that. Nobody said no, so I'll take that as assent. Right, okay, well, thank you for that, and thank you particularly to Mr Ashcroft and Mr Pegram, and it's great to see you firing on all cylinders again. Well, you look as though you're firing on all cylinders.
Maybe three.
Yeah, okay, three and a half, or 3 3/4. But anyway, thank you for all the input, thank you for the reports, and as I say, you have expressed or addressed a lot of the concerns.
Work program.
Yeah, I know, yeah. So please continue keeping the Rushcliffe Borough Council reputation onwards and upwards, and better than other councils.
Absolutely. Yes, that's what we want.
Yeah. Right, okay, thanks for that. So on to the other item, which was item number, I can't remember what it was, but it's the work programme, which you have before us. Is there anything you want to make? I know we've got down here possibly in July, possibly alternative energy.
Yeah, I think there was a question about whether or not that, because that's not been agreed yet, whether or not that comes to the July meeting, or we potentially leave that as a one item agenda again, because its conservation areas might have quite a lot of discussion. And then obviously the 21st of September, we've got the COVID-19 business recovery, which might be a shorter one, so it might sit better there.
Yes, there's been a suggestion that we look at alternative energy, and so conservation areas could well be a full meeting, as we've just proven, looking at planning communication. So perhaps if your agreement, we keep conservation areas part 2 as a single item, and then put alternative energy as a supplementary item or second item to, along with the COVID-19 business recovery update. Any particular comments, or everybody generally in favour with that? Any other comments on we have got coming up very soon in January 2023 and March 2023, only a year away. We've got the work programme on each one so far, so they have yet to be filled. Any comments on the work programme, or everybody agree with that? I'll take that everybody is in agreement. So with that, we've come to the end of our discussion. So thank you very much indeed, Councillor Upton and Councillor Comlack, for joining us and helping with our discussion. And with that, I shall